Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Words of Wisdom. Today our focus is on conflict and conflict resolution. As we all know that life is full of conflicts. There are emotional conflicts and there are social conflicts. There are religious conflicts and there are political conflicts. And we have different ways to deal with conflicts. Some people deal with conflicts with anger and resentment, violence and war. And there are others who deal with anger in a peaceful way. They want to create harmony. They want to create peace in the world, in the family, in the community. So today the guest that I've invited has a special interest, a keen interest in conflict resolution in a peaceful way. This is the gentleman who has been my friend for a long time. I have a lot of respect for him. He was a lawyer in Pakistan, and when he came to Canada, he got involved with the government of Ontario and helping hundreds of people with conflict resolution in a peaceful way. And then I found out that he also has a keen interest in the political arena in the Middle East, the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. And I thought it will be a great opportunity to invite him and ask him his views, his ideas, his ideals, his philosophy about peaceful conflict resolution. So here we are with Shahid Akhtar.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Khalid. Thank you for a very kind introduction. Now I have to live up to it.
No. You would have no problem. I was curious that I know, Shahid, you have been presenting your ideas in local, national, international forums. You have been interviewed on many channels. So when I suggested that I would interview you for this sort of a dialogue about Trump and about Middle East and about the conflict resolution and the ways you have been helping people with those things, how did you feel coming for this interview?
Well, actually, I was very excited because particularly when I heard that this is the program that is almost entirely your creation, it's your baby, you are being a psychotherapist, being the administrator of creative psychotherapy, I believe that creativity is actually the key for almost any resolution of any conflict if we remain traditional. And one thing about you that I have always admired is that any time, whether it's your literature, whether it is organizing some groups, and from what I have heard about your own therapy, you are a non-traditional person. And I firmly believe in that non-tradition as well, because I think that if we go by the traditional way of doing things, then we would still be living in the cave. We will still have exactly the same views as Abel and Cain had. We will never try to get out of those self-imposed limitations sometimes we place on ourselves. And yet I see in everyday life, there are people, anytime you ask them, why have you done this? Why have you resolved this dispute or dealt with this dispute in such a way? Why did you go for litigation? Why did you have to be confrontational about it? And you know what their reply is? It's always been done like that.
Yeah.
This is how things are done.
That's true.
It is true about workplace, particularly about workplace, where innovation is the first thing that they tell you should do. But the moment you try to innovate, you're challenged because people want to do things exactly the way they have been done. And that's why my approach to this is extremely non-traditional, and we'll talk more about it. But I want to thank you for this introduction, though.
Sure.
You have, the way you have defined conflict, various categories of it, various types of it, you have done a fantastic job. So you have given me an entire parameter where you and I will talk. And the reason I like this program particularly because I feel personally, I feel very comfortable just engaging in conversation, because I think that there is so much playing to the gallery these days. When you look at the talking heads in any TV program, half the time, frankly, they are looking at the camera, not the person they are talking to, and they seem to have their own hidden agenda, rather than answering the question that they're asked. So that way I'm looking forward to this conversation with you, because as you know, I think you'll agree with me, that the art of conversation is almost a dying art.
That's true.
Unless already dead.
So, Shahid, let me start today in this interview with the most recent phenomenon, the most recent event. There is something very unusual happened in the history of the Middle East and the history of America. So I'm going to read you a statement that I think will sort of give us the start for this.
Sure.
In the New York Times on December 6th, 2017, it was written, and I quote, from Washington, President Trump on Wednesday formally recognized Jerusalem as the capital and setting in motion a plan to move the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to the fiercely contested Holy City. Quote, today we finally acknowledge the obvious, that Jerusalem is Israel's capital, unquote. Mr. Trump said from the diplomatic reception room of the White House, quote, this is nothing more or less than a recognition of reality. It is also the right thing to do. It is something that has to be done, unquote. Recognizing Jerusalem, he added, was, quote, a long overdue step to advance the peace process. The announcement, officials said, was recognition of current and historic reality. West Jerusalem is the seat of Israel's government, and recognizing it as such would remove ambiguity from the American position, they said, unquote. Although it's a long statement, but I wanted to share, Shahid, with you, because I think this is very important for us to understand the significance. I think, and because you have a keen interest in the Middle East process, the peace process, I was curious how you see this Trump's sort of declaration and making this statement.
Well, first of all, I think anytime you prefix a statement by saying Trump's, that changes almost everything. It is a unique phenomenon that is happening in American history. Things have never been the same as they are now. So we have to take everything that Trump says with a grain of salt. If I can sprinkle my conversation with just a little bit of Urdu verse, I would say that हैं कवाकिब कुछ नजर आते हैं कुछ देते हैं धोखा ये बाजीगर खुला. You should never take Trump on the face value, in the sense that the statement that he has made, he means it exactly the way it is stated. He read a statement. In his case, you really do not know what his next step would be, what his intention would be, how would he follow it through. Having said that, he still hasn't said anything new. Everything that he said in that statement has been American position since 1995. It has been American position for the longest time, except what happened, if just to give you some background of this Israel, Jerusalem as a capital, what has been happening is that every 6 months, American presidents were authorized to exercise a waiver so that they don't have to take action on this. But this is a law. Congress passed it. This is an existing reality. He has done nothing that is different from what other presidents have done. And Khalid, in some ways, I think in a way, Trump is a blessing in disguise. And the blessing in disguise is this, that he is saying and doing most of the things that previous American presidents have done. Except what they had done, they had made you swallow a very bitter pill, but they had sugar-coated it. They would talk very softly about it. They would talk about being fair to both sides. They would always talk about neutral, indifferent, honest broker. And we know, everybody knows, even they know, that they are not honest brokers. They are not brokers at all. They're the advocates of one particular side, and they're trying to impress upon the other side that this side that we are with is the right side. So Trump has just continued, and being a very crude and blunt politician that he is, he just said it in the term that no other president would have said. Otherwise, the American policy from the very start has been that they would recognize this as a capital. They would even move the embassy there, except for considerations that were purely pragmatic, that had to do with actual hot war, intifadas, reaction, violence, loss of life. They thought that that was not the proper time. So even this is not the proper time because, again, going into some background, the agreement after Oslo has been that the Jerusalem city's status will be determined by agreement between the two parties. And Trump again has indicated in that whatever the two parties agreed to. So his statement in many ways is very significant, but in many other ways it says nothing.
So thank you for giving that sort of a background to put it in the context. While I sort of started researching this, I came across with another statement from the Arab side, from the Palestinian side, from the Arab countries. And I wanted to get your opinion on that. So a week after that, December 6th, on December 13th, the next Wednesday, there was another statement. Then that is from Istanbul, from Turkey. And let me read it to you. Leaders and officials of Muslim nations declared East Jerusalem the Palestinian capital on Wednesday at a summit meeting in Istanbul, producing the strongest response yet to President Trump's decision to recognize the city as Israel's capital. The gathering of the 57-member Organization of Islamic Cooperation was held to formulate a unified response from the Muslim world to Mr. Trump's decision last week. The meeting condemned in communique sort of being that Mr. Trump's unilateral and dangerous declaration as an effort to change the status of Jerusalem. So I wanted to share that this was to me a strong response, a collective response, and sort of a very sort of in a way sort of showing the world what their position is. So I wanted to have your opinion that were you surprised with Muslim countries coming together and taking this stance, or you were not surprised?
Well, there is really nothing that is surprising in this because Jerusalem is one of those very rare places which is very, very sacred to three major Abrahamic religions. And Muslims are very emotionally attached to that. So much so that you might remember or might have read about it because it may have been before your time, that King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, the only king who actually stood up to United States at his time, he said that his lifelong desire was to say a prayer in Masjid al-Aqsa. And having expressed that opinion, I don't know if it was very directly related to that, but a few days after, his nephew beheaded him, and nobody could figure out what was behind that. That was the time when Saudi Arabia imposed embargo, restrictions on oil exports to the United States. That was the time when the real oil crisis started. After that, Saudi Arabia has never stood up to United States, particularly for its principles. So, but the sentiment of Muslims everywhere, they're so emotionally attached. They may not be Arabs. They may be in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, but the moment the issue of Jerusalem comes, people get extremely sentimental. And the Jewish side, Israeli side, is also equally attached. They think that biblical sayings, commands, give them the right to claim that place as a capital. So this reaction, you know, that famous principle that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, this was the kind of reaction that was expected. Although there were many people who were wondering that perhaps all these countries, particularly the Muslim countries, will give in to the American pressure. to the extent that the statement is concerned, they did not. They stood up to it. But the real proof will be, proof of the pudding will be the eating.
Sure.
This depends then how further manipulations are done, particularly with some Arab and Muslim autocratic societies, governments particularly, where the public may be very much against American moves, but the governments are taking so much aid from America that they may have to think twice before they can actually take any practical step. But it did not surprise me at all. As a matter of fact, next day, just yesterday, you have seen what happened in the United Nations, that 128 countries favored this same resolution, which was rejected in the Security Council, but passed, and only 9 countries were on the side of America. And those 9 countries, other than Israel and America, were really very, very small countries. Some of the countries people don't even know the name of. So it is not surprising, it is expected, but if you ask me what will be the eventual outcome, frankly, I don't see much changing. There'll be political football going on, because unless and until people change their very basic attitude, the governments change their basic attitude in pro-Palestine, particularly pro-Palestine government, nothing concrete would happen. It will just, another news item will take this away from the headlines.
Now, there is one related thing that for me was significant, and I want to get your opinion how significant it is. I read in the newspapers, in the media, that American sort of government said that when these sort of in the United Nations, when people will cast a vote in favor or against, that America will keep an eye on the people voting favor or against, because Trump said that they get millions of dollars aid from us, and then they are voting against us. We will keep an eye on that. I thought, sort of, I'm curious, what do you think of this kind of American sort of a posturing?
Well, posturing, I think you're being very kind and very polite to Mr. Trump. It's not posturing, it's bullying. It is actually telling people that if you want money, vote with us. It is exactly the total opposite, 180 degrees of democracy, democratic principles. America has been going out in the world trying to persuade everyone, force everyone, attacking and engage them in wars even to promote democracy. And yet, the basic rule of democracy is that a vote should be free, a vote should not be tampered with bribes or with aid or with any threat. And yet internationally, the country which talks about basically rule of law as its foundation is really trampling over the rule of international law. And I just want to explain one thing here.
Sure.
When we say international law, generally in international law, what happens, people think that there is a national law and there is international law. In the case of United States, there is a lot of anger about following any international law, because they think that international law is an encroachment about their sovereignty. These laws, that Geneva Conventions and signing of all the treaties that America has made, they are not international law. Senate has actually gone ahead and passed those laws as American laws. Now, to defy those international laws, you should define your own internal laws. But again, the way the news is presented, it is presented in a way that you can only draw one conclusion and the other conclusion is hidden. The respect for law, and order has to be the same nationally, internationally. Rules of democracy have to be the same for everyone. It is not that if you have the power, the rule still stands that might is right. And people try to convince themselves that no, we are living in a very civilized age. Now might is not right anymore. My vote is heavier than that. Yet what happens that people like Trump, they come in and they threaten all other countries, exactly defying the principle that the United States Constitution was founded upon.
Now, let me take this discussion to another level, because I feel that your sort of keen interest in democracy and in law is connected with your backgrounds. I want our audience, people watching, to get an idea of your background. But my understanding is that when you were in Pakistan, you had a certain education and training and exposure to the world of the law. So give me and our audience, how did you get inspired to enter the field of law when you were in Pakistan?
Well, actually, I should tell you this. Like you, my father wanted me to be a doctor. So I got admitted in pre-medical. And frankly, other than dissecting frogs, I don't remember anything interesting taking place. And that was not really very interesting either, but it was something memorable. Or collecting skeletons. So very reluctantly, fearfully, I begged my father to allow me to go into arts. And when I went into arts, I found that almost everything that I was doing, reading a newspaper, was almost doing your homework. Sitting in the coffee house, Lahore, was something that contributed to how you did your papers. And I wanted to do law because that was my forte at that time. And yet, after my university, there was very little time that I spent in Pakistan in law practice. I came to Canada, and here I was fortunate enough eventually to get a job in harassment, discrimination prevention, human rights compliance for civil servants. And with that human rights compliance, I found that A, the law degree sort of came in handy at that time, and B, if there was one passion that I can say that I possess, although sometimes it's very difficult when you ask yourself the question, okay, tell me, what's your passion? You have to think about certain things. But funny enough, there is a litmus test for that passion. Your body tells you what your passion is. If you're indulging in that, your physical reaction will never lie to you, as you know better than anybody else. Body can never lie. It's that system we're blessed with, the radar that we have. And that, what I found was, one thing that I could not stomach was the arrogance of the powerful, the arrogance of the mighty. And that arrogance does not mean that you're only talking about dictators. You're talking only about the autocratic rulers. It happens in almost every sphere of life, particularly in the workplace. The management and union, even the union officers and the staff, the supervisors and the person who reports to them. There's such a hierarchy that you really wonder sometimes that what has happened to all those great books on management written, because when you see the actual behavior, whoever has the power, they try to abuse that power as best as they can, unless there are restrictions. So the policy that I was administering for more than 18 years in the government, that policy was preventing discrimination based on human rights, harassment based on human rights, which included, by the way, sexual harassment, which is full of news these days.
Now, I've heard many times from you in our sort of private sort of discussions that based on your these hundreds of experiences with different parts of the province, with different organizations, with different sort of these peaceful resolutions that you have done, that you have created a kind of a roadmap, that what I remember is 7 C's, that you have a certain particular stance to do this process in a peaceful way rather than a confrontative and sort of in a more sort of a violent sort of way. Can you share with me and our people the sort of an essence of what this 7 C's philosophy is that you have created?
Well, I'll be very brief about it because it's relatively a lengthier process. What I noticed that any time there was an issue, and I'm only talking about my experience, in the workplace or within the management, that it was almost invariably there was a confrontational approach to it. You would either file a complaint and it would go through the process of tribunals, human rights tribunals even, or you would go to the police, or you would go to the courts, and invariably, even if you won, what would happen is that you would win, but the person against whom you had filed the complaint or who had filed the complaint against you, the harasser or the harassee, both the person was discriminated against and the discriminator, one of them would win. But as a result of that, the other person, for the rest of their work life, they would resent that victory. Their relationship will be completely gone, and the workplace would suffer because of that. So what I started to do initially, when I started this work, I would also follow the standard practice. A complaint, a violation of human rights would come to my attention, and I would assign an investigator. Investigator would find that one side was wrong, one side was right, and a winner-loser decision would be made. So then I started to mediate those disputes and got engaged myself. And Khalid, I noticed that the whole mediation process, and I'll just briefly mention it to you. Let's, just as an example, let's say this A files a complaint against B that B has violated their human rights. Now, when they would come to my attention, I would first of all meet with A, who is the complainant, individually talk to that person, try to win their trust so that they can talk to you about what is behind that complaint. Because 90% of the time, when you hear somebody complaining officially about an issue, that statement is not the reflective issue. It does not reflect exactly what's going on. There's something else behind that and beneath that. So, but if they trust you, and that had to be a condition, that you had to be totally independent, impartial, and indifferent, they would tell you that really this is the real issue that I have. Then you would talk to the other party and try to win their trust. Now there are two people now, they're not talking to each other, but they're talking to you and they trust you. With that basis, which is the key to any successful mediation, then they're brought in jointly. And I tell you, when they're first time, they're sitting like you and I are sitting. If looks could kill, there'll be dead bodies there. They would be so hostile. But you would create a safe environment, almost guaranteeing that you will make sure that there are some ground rules, that they will be respectful to each other, they will not badmouth each other, and of course, there'll be no violence. And then when one would start telling their story, the disbelief that the perpetrator would have, they wouldn't believe that they could actually have caused that much harm. They wouldn't even believe their own power. And after that, I would invite them together to brainstorm the resolution of the issue. Now, both of them agree with that. It is no longer your or my issue, it's our issue. So there is one thing written that this is the issue between us. If we resolve this, then there is no problem between us. That agreement, it takes a long time for them to come to this, but eventually they come to this, they define it. Once they define it, they brainstorm freely, most ridiculous to most sublime, and then they choose. Some of them may actually be practical. Then out of those, some, 2 or 3 are things on which they can both agree. So they do not have to sell their agreement, whatever they agree with. The thing is, it's those 2 people who have agreed on an issue
Sure.
and agreed on, out of so many choices they had through brainstorming, that out of those 20, 30, 40, 50, but the condition is this, that whatever the solution is, it has to be within those brainstorm
Sure.
resolutions.
Sure.
So nobody can say that there is not a resolution. There is, although it is included among those 30 or 40. So once they have agreed to that, they don't sell it to anybody else. Would you, as they say in Urdu,
Ji.
Mia Bibi Razi, Kya Karega Qazi?
Yeah.
They have a resolution of their own.
Now, at one time you mentioned that this peaceful conflict resolution, non-confrontative, is based on 7 principles that you call 7 C's. I know there's 7 sort of words. I don't know whether you remember all 7 of them.
Yes, I do.
If you remember, then can you share
Yes.
with us what those 7 C's are?
Well, again, as you said, there are 7 words.
Yeah.
They just
Sure.
happen to all start
With C.
with a C. Sometimes it seems just as if it's contrived, but it is not.
Sure.
Because those 7 C's, even in a sequence or standalone,
Sure.
those are the keys to resolving almost any dispute, as long as you apply those 7 C's
Sure.
as prescribed in your
Sure.
terms, as prescribed, then you are at least guaranteed.
Sure.
And even though guarantee is something very strong, very powerful, you're guaranteed the best possible outcome given the circumstances. And I will explain if you have any questions about those 7 C's, but I'll just narrate them.
Sure.
They are conciliation, commitment, compassion, communication, concentration, compromise, and culmination.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now, I know we have 7 days of the week, and there are 7 steps in the mystical path. So when you were conceiving these 7, did you have anything special? Why 7, not 5 or 9? Or they just came out to be 7?
Actually, initially there were 4.
Yeah.
But then 3 others, I found they were so popular when I exercised in my practice of
Sure.
conflict resolution. And among them was compassion, concentration, and compromise.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And if as we proceed, I can certainly explain
Sure.
how each one of those C's helps towards
Sure.
arriving at a resolution.
Sure.
But I just wanted to sort of narrate it out.
Sure. Okay. Now, I'm curious because these 7 C's are not only sort of applicable to 2 people, it could be between 2 families, it could be 2 communities, it could be 2 cultures, it could be 2 countries. So I always sort of wondered how you started this sort of a 7 C's at a professional level with 2 parties in a professional or workplace organization. How from there you started to have a keen interest in politics, especially the Middle Eastern politics. How did that, was that going on side by side, or you shifted from one professional to the community level? How did that happen?
No, actually, it evolved on its own, because every time I would conduct a mediation, I would engage in conflict resolution. The basic thing, again, was that first of all, you had to conciliate with the fact, with what is. Isness becomes your business. Because unless you reconcile with the fact as is, unless you know what the problem is, unless you conciliate with it, you cannot begin to resolve it. And in interfaith context, which apparently doesn't seem in any way related to the workplace, because these are 2 totally different worlds, I found that even in those interfaith conflicts, these attributes were playing a major role. So once you conciliate with a fact, then you have to ensure that is there a commitment for that or not. In the Middle Eastern context, what happened? That there was actually no commitment to resolve the issue. not only you cannot be one-sided to it. You cannot say that only Israel didn't want it, Palestinians always wanted it. The Palestinian leadership as well. There were proof after proof that both sides felt that the vested interest of those who were the leaders, the vested interest was that the problem should continue. So the commitment was not there. And then the third C, which was compassion, the compassion was particularly lacking. Because many times you would hear one side talking about all the tragedies that are happening without applying the same standard to the other side. In our interfaith practice, for example, in the Middle East practice, we were very direct, we were very blunt about it, that the grief of a mother of a Jewish child is exactly the same for that child's hurt or suffering or death that the mother of a Palestinian child. You cannot have a grade by which you say that if this happens to an Israeli child, it's more tragic. If it happens to a Palestinian child, it's less tragic. That compassion was lacking. And similarly, the concentration, which is under the sea, was lacking in this Middle Eastern thing, because every time some other news item would appear in the paper, this issue will be buried. Nobody would talk about it. For years, nobody would talk about it. Then politically, when they thought that it's now, it serves our purpose, they would take this out, brush it again, and present it as a major issue. And similarly, in this, when I found that with that concentration, the communication particularly was missing. And that's a huge piece, because communication is you have to understand where the other person is coming from. What are they? Is the message being sent? Same message is received. How many times, Khalid, you have seen that people would carpet bomb a place and then say, oh, we did that because we wanted to send them a message. Can't a letter do that?
Sure.
Can't a telephone call do that?
Sure.
Can't an email do that?
Sure.
That this is my message?
Sure.
But to choose that as a communication message was fatal and lethal. And then the compromise, the second last C, compromise, was lacking in that. Because you would not consider that you cannot get 100% of everything. Any time you seek 100%, you end up getting nothing. But neither side, particularly the side with the power, was not ready to compromise. And in the Middle East, the last C that was applicable was there was no concept of culmination. Nobody wanted to put a closure to it, because it kept you in power. It kept you going for those selfish vested interests that you had. So that way, I found that the Middle Eastern conflict, and as a matter of fact, any political conflict, if the leaders, they show their willingness that yes, they're ready, then this process, this methodology can guarantee a resolution. Again, with a qualifier, best under the circumstances.
Now, coming back from the political to the personal, Shahid, I have a number of friends who are involved with many philosophies, ideologies. Some are dedicated communists, some are dedicated Marxists, some are anarchists, some are even sort of with a religious ideology, with very Islamist. They sort of have taken a step forward to be part of that political process, part of that being, we can call them a political activist. So I want to get a sense that your own perception of yourself. Do you see yourself as a political activist? Do you see yourself as a peace activist? Do you see yourself as a social activist? You see yourself as a human rights activist? How do you perceive in this process, because you've been involved for a number of years, maybe decades? How do you conceive your philosophical sort of a role in this process?
Khalid, you must have heard Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said that in every human heart, evil and goodness lies side by side. I, for some reason, and I'm talking to you from very personal terms, I cannot reconcile to be 100% for one ideology and then think as if that is the right ideology and everything else is wrong, or at least the opposing ideologies are wrong. I cannot reconcile with that. What I believe in is that each ideology has some very important, very good points in it, and there are some which don't work out well. I want to choose the attributes, and wherever that attribute may be, I'll go with that for that particular purpose. This happens in religion, in political ideology, in economic system. I cannot say that capitalism is evil and communism is virtuous, or vice versa. I cannot say that one religion is the only path to truth, and every other religion, followers of that religion will burn in hell, no matter how good they are on this earth. For all these things, there is a little divine living within us. And in that respect, I don't know if you would call it religious or not, but I'm very impressed with people like Rumi, with people like Bulle Shah, for example. They have values that are dear to them. They believe in sanctity of human life and its connection to the higher forces. Now, that higher forces, I have absolutely no problem if somebody calls it Bhagwan, somebody calls it God, somebody calls it Allah. It doesn't matter. And I also don't believe in this because I see it in my conflict resolution practice as well. I see it that some people have made it an industry. They would go after one religion, they would put it down. Let's say Islam, for example. They would be so venomous against Islam, and yet they would not see parallels that are happening in other religions. So I cannot accept that. What I will accept is, I will accept that Islam says, if you take one life, it is as if you have taken the entire humanity. I believe in that. But I also believe that if a Buddhist says, don't hurt anyone, that is also something that I can follow. And I don't need to. This is one thing that I may differ from many of my liberal friends. I don't need to denounce my religion for that. I don't have to declare that as of today, I'm renouncing the culture, the religion I was born in. If I have to do something, and my culture, my upbringing, and my religious background supports it, I'll do that. If not, I'll seek that attribute wherever it may be.
So let's come to the end of this sort of our discussion. I'm curious that now you both of us are not sort of teenagers or young. You have gray hair and I have gray hair. So we are reaching what I call the evening of our life. So we may not have 50 years, maybe 5, 10, 15 years. So I'm curious because you had this passion, this interest in law, in human rights, in conflict resolution. I'm curious that for the next 5, 10 years, what do you see your role? What do you see your future? In your mind, what you could do in the next few years that you will feel that you have led a very successful, very meaningful life? What does the next few years sort of look like for you to make it peaceful, meaningful, successful for you?
Well, that's a very good culminating question. But first about the gray hair, at least you have gray hair.
Yeah.
So that's, but in any case, At this time, I find this stage really, in many ways, I think it's a kind of exaggerated term, but almost an ideal stage, because this is the time when, in many ways, you're not running after livelihood. You seem to have achieved many things that you wanted to, and yet this is a stage when you can see the goalpost as well. The mortality issue becomes a very prominent issue at this stage. But rather than depressing you, rather than frustrating you, rather than impoverishing you, that gives you a very interesting concept of preciousness of the time that you have. So in your youth, you want to do something, you're very happy with this or sad, but there's so much time left, you think. Now, at this stage, as you see the years pass, you say, my goodness, I can see that time is very limited. And every moment is almost like sucking the nectar out of this fruit of life. That whatever you do, you put the most in your least. You put your heart in anything that you do, because that is the way to live. You live it up. The actual class, the actual status, the actual position does not matter as much. That's why just last month, we were invited to a parliamentary hearing. And in that parliamentary hearing, when I went there, I mentioned exactly the same thing to them, that you have this opportunity, this given time. You may not be parliamentarian tomorrow. You can influence. You can be a force of influence for good. So even if you can contribute a little thing, just do your part. And that is the stage I find myself at, that in any way I can influence. Even this program is actually, for me, it's a very precious thing. I'm sharing something with you. People may see it, people may want to get something out of it. I have learned a lot talking to you. Maybe we can pass it on to other people. And at this time, my only goal in life is that I may be a influence on some people to do their part for the good that they can.
Now let's complete the circle, go back to where we started, that at this present time, in December 2017, Trump makes this statement. The Palestinians, the Arabs, the Muslims, they make a statement. The United Nations is making a statement. So with your political wisdom, what do you foresee? If you want to see for the Middle East, the process, what do you foresee happening in the next few years? What do you...
frankly, on this, as things are, I don't see much changes in the next few years. The only time changes will come if it comes from the grassroots and people get so fed up with the status quo that they decide that nothing will stop them from changing their life, as long as they rely on the leadership that they have. I was in Palestine just 2 years ago, and I find when I talk to ordinary Palestinians, they were very critical, of course, of the occupation, but they were equally critical of the leadership as well. Because they think that the leadership has vested interest and it has not given them what they have been seeking. So unless the grassroots, they take responsibility and do whatever is in their power, things will just continue for quite some time, because the powers that be, they don't have that commitment to resolving this issue.
So since you visited that Middle East, let me give you one observation or experience that I had when I visited Israel, and sort of ask you a controversial. So far I've been sort of more gentle with you. Let me ask you a controversial question. When I was in Israel, I went to attend a conference, a psychiatric conference, presented a paper. And there were a number of people who came to, there were psychologists, social workers. So they invited me for dinner at their home. So I had my first dinner with a Jewish family. So I asked them about this war and this whatever. So this lady, this Jewish lady said to me that I don't want my son to go to war. I want peace. But her impression was that the local people, the Jewish people in Israel, are more open to have this peaceful negotiation. She partly blamed it on the Jewish people living in North America. She said these people who are away from Israel, who do not live this day-to-day reality, they from America and other parts of the world, they are sort of like a remote control, investing money, and they have a certain interest, and they keep this conflict sort of going. So in a way, what she was presenting to me, and I don't know about the politics, that the Jewish and Palestinian issues in the Middle East are partly controlled by the powers in America. And she was kind of unhappy or sort of dissatisfied with that state. So since you have a more keen sort of insight into that, do you feel that her observation or her statement have some value in it?
I think it has a lot of value in it. And as a matter of fact, it's not controversial at all, because I'm almost in total agreement with you that your observation was very correct. In Israel and Palestine, you can say things about government policies very openly, without any problem. Nobody will sort of look at you in a funny way. In North America, there are things you cannot even utter before you are called anti-Semite or prejudiced or Islamophobe or whatever. The level of discussion within that society is far more open than you would find. Now you could call it anything. People associate it with actually the guilt that the West has had with their treatment of Jewish community. I want to tell you this, I generally don't mention it in programs like this, but there is a very common belief that Jewish community controls everything and they have their way above their weight and numbers. The fact is, not too long ago, very recently, there was a plaque on the beaches in Toronto which said Jews and blacks not allowed. Not too long ago, just during the World War II, a ship came with Jewish refugees, and a Canadian politician said, when somebody asked, why did you not allow them to land? And he said, none is too many. None is too many. So they have suffered. Now maybe it is that guilt of the West which stops them from engaging in an open dialogue. But in Israel, they don't have that guilt. They talk very openly. Some of the strongest critics of the right-wing Netanyahu government are Israeli Jews. They're even more strong in their criticism than many Palestinians. So your observation is very correct.
Okay. So I'm glad that we had this sort of very passionate discussion, and I try to sort of, even for our people who will be watching this interview, to get a sort of essence. I know you have done a lot, and I can only capture just a small part of your struggles, of your ideas, of your ideals, of your, Is there any last statement, comment you want to make before we conclude this interview today?
Well, all I would say is that thank you very much for inviting me and sharing some of the things that I have done. Maybe this will be the trigger, as you and I have talked so often, to compile it in a more concrete way, and perhaps distribute that more openly and generally, and make this 7 C's. And I hope that your viewers can also, before they start something confrontational and adversarial, they will think about not go into litigation, but try to mediate their disputes. Thank you very much again.
Okay. Thank you, Shahid. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is we come to the conclusion ending of this interview. I really want to share with you that Shahid Akhtar has been very modest even in this interview, but he has played a significant role not only with the government of Ontario, but also in the community at a local level and a national and international level. He's very passionate, and I have been encouraging him or hoping, inspiring him, trying to inspire him that he could write a book about this conflict resolution, starting from the personal to the social to the religious to the political. And I hope that this discussion he will carry on and write a book, and all of you can one day buy it from the Amazon or ebooks of Shahid Akhtar. So I'm just giving him that sort of a comment, so that because I'm mentioning in this interview that he will complete this project because he has so much political wisdom and social wisdom that I think that message should go as far and wide as possible. And this interview was just my humble acknowledgement of his dedication, his commitment, his works for human rights, and my friendly token of appreciating that work. So thank you very much for listening to this interview.